Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today for this reading of Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign. This will be a selection of readings plus a brief question and answer period at the end of the session. I think Jimmy would approve because it's the fireside chat model that he championed as president. Before we begin, and as folks are joining, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Amber Roessner. I'm an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee. I received my PhD from the University of Georgia in the College of the College of Journalism and Mass Communication in 2010. And this particular book has its roots within that program. It was actually the second dissertation idea that I had, and my committee very savvily explained to me that the best dissertation is a done dissertation, and that perhaps based upon the scope of the scholarship that I was committed to engaging in, that I should wait until I finished my PhD and started my new career before engaging in it. I'm from Winder, Georgia originally. Carter, as he campaigned for president in 1976, he did engage with a lot of individuals from Winder and Athens and all over the state. Moreover, I guess now it's time to tell you a little bit about the book as more people have joined us. This book is a decade in the making. Overall, it involved the analysis of more than 25,000 primary source documents that straddled the manuscript collections of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and also manuscript collections all across the United States. It also involved the analysis of thousands of media texts, including the top 6 circulating newspapers in the country at the time, the top 3 news magazines, and trade publications, and also television. So I got to look through Vanderbilt's television news archives and engaged in extensive research there. And then I also got to engage in what I call an examination of memory text. So I engaged in in-depth interviews with a number of the campaign workers who worked on Jimmy Carter's 1976 campaign. Notably absent from that group was Jody Powell, who was Carter's press secretary, and Hamilton Jordan, who became his executive in the office, the White House, but was his campaign director. And then I also interviewed a ton of journalists for the book, including Walter Mears, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1976 for his campaign coverage. And some pretty amazing editorial cartoonists, Paul Zepp, the late Tony Off. Who else? Wes Pippert, who was United Press reporter. Carl Wubstorff Jr., Curtis Wilkie, Judy Woodruff, Tom Brokaw, Sam Donaldson. And I almost forgot perhaps the most important person, Jimmy Carter, and I had the opportunity to interview him in October of 2015, the weekend that I learned that I was pregnant with my only son. And what a wonderful experience that was to be able to engage in an interview with him for the purpose of this book. Perhaps in the question and answer session, we will have an opportunity to engage about that interview and any other questions that you might But for the moment, we'll go ahead and get started with the reading. So, Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign. Introduction. Time's Miracle Man. Jimmy Carter's piercing blue eyes gazed out from the cover of Henry Luce's Legacy News magazine as middle managers perused headlines at the Eastern Lobby Shop in New York's Pan Am building. Elite intellectuals lingered near Harvard Square's out-of-town news, and University of Georgia co-eds streaked past Barnett's newsstand in Athens on January the 3rd, 1977. Just a year ago, he was walking up to men and women who did not know that he existed, shaking their hands and drawling, "I'm Jimmy Carter, and I'm going to be your next president." Time staff acknowledged in the cover story's lead. The notion seemed preposterous, but the outsider defied expectations and prevailed, achieving a political miracle. Since 1927, when Luce established Time's special issue, newsworthy politicians and celebrities often entered neck-and-neck races for the coveted Man of the Year designation. But editor-in-chief Hedley Donovan, managing editor Henry Grunwald, Washington bureau chief Hugh Sidey, and other Times staff settled on a clear decision when deliberating over the fate of the special issue in late fall, citing the peanut farmer's impressive rise and the great anticipation surrounding his presidency and the new phase he marked in American life. Though the decade was later characterized as a mere bridge between cultural revolts of the 1960s and corporate takeovers of the 1980s, Time staff offered an apt assessment. The 1970s were a period of transformation in American politics and journalism that determined the present moment. Moreover, these prominent political actors and preliminary historians shrewdly recognized that Carter was a natural choice for their profitable commemorative issue, because his rise to power was one of the most astonishing in the history of the Republic. News of the special issue brought joy to the hearts of the newsmaking whiz kids who fashioned Carter's miracle through an intentional image craft strategy involving modified showbiz campaign approaches designed to frame words, sounds, and images embodied in the peanut farmer physicist for president's candidacy. Moreover, they welcomed Time correspondents back to Plains, Georgia, population 683. One of the main scenes for Carter's trendy, down-home Southern campaign, designed to simultaneously tap into cultural desires for sincere authenticity in U.S. politics and the New South. Cravings that had manifested themselves in popular films such as Michael Ritchie's The Candidate and Robert Altman's Nashville. In anticipation of the special issue, Grunwald commissioned the cover to James Browning Wyeth, a contemporary American realist painter who had previously captured presidential portraits of John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Inspired by family patriarch N.C. Wyeth, he encouraged Carter to pose outdoors before plowed pasture lands and the Plains Water Tower, which bore the image of an American flag. The ensuing portrait offered a rendering of the peanut farmer who promised a government as good as its people. Clad in the working man's denim informality, a bricolage constructed by the campaign image merchants. With this scene, the candidate's stage manager sought to signify Carter's pastoral roots, the nation's nostalgic site of innocence, lost to the post-industrial sheen that the Democratic Party's savior symbolically promised to resurrect. Nearby this site in late December, Times staff writers Stanley Cloud and Bonnie Angela, alongside Sidey and Chief of Correspondence Murray Gart, interviewed the president-elect in his ranch home. And though Carter's imagecraft advisors once again were on hand to serve as chief liaisons between frontline reporters and their audiences by controlling access, managing rapport, and negotiating mediated images. These commanding reporters, weary of attempts to sell the presidency after recent scandals, peppered Carter with questions about his plan to implement an open administration. Accordingly, after acknowledging his media genius as the candidate of the 70s in the cover story, they promptly turned to the vogue mode of adversarial watchdog journalism in reporting on the president-elect's transition operations. Hence, as Carter's staff examined the special issue more closely, they encountered the recurring theme that had haunted their personal media campaign since its opening stages. He is complex and sometimes contradictory, Time staff appraised Carter's enigmatic qualities. His creed combines traditionally antithetical elements of help the deprived populism and deny thyself fiscal conservatism. Moreover, as Carter's advisors continued to scour news clips, they discovered that they were the butt of the joke in humorist Art Buchwald's most recent syndicated column. As prudent students of the post-1968 reforms, Carter's staff had exploited free and paid national exposure surrounding their personal campaign in the preceding months. But as Buchwald quipped, many Americans now suffered from the Carter syndrome, an overdose of Time's Man of the Year. Amid his permanent campaign, their malaise would worsen in the years to come. In their special issue analysis, Time staff acknowledged that Carter's salient grassroots media campaign had sparked one of the most astonishing political miracles in the nation's history. And though they and their intellectual successors recognized that Carter's impressive rise signaled a new phase in American life, they neglected to thoroughly examine, 1, the definitive shift from a party system ruled predominantly by urban machines and party bosses to a primary system dominated by mass media. And 2, the increased significance of the negotiation of political images in the fortunes of permanent campaigns for the White House. Recognizing these omissions, this book probes into how shifting conditions in American politics and journalism contributed to the performances of unexpected winners and losers in the bicentennial campaign, and considers how these individuals help determine existing conditions in American presidential politics and campaign journalism. This book tells the story of a transformative moment in American politics and journalism by examining Time's 1976 Miracle Man through a representational and relational analysis of media texts, memory texts, and archival documents surrounding the negotiation of political images by presidential aspirants, campaign consultants, frontline reporters, and various publics involved in the bicentennial campaign. The book ultimately follows 7 primary arguments. After the mid-century shift towards primary showbiz politics, presidential candidates increasingly depended upon a new class of campaign workers, political consultants, skilled image merchants, in other words, pollsters, public relations consultants, advertising specialists, and television advisors, who capitalized on the visual authority of mass media to sell campaigns to special interest groups and individual constituents. My, that's a long sentence. This emerging rank of campaign operatives worked alongside traditional campaign personnel, such as press secretaries, media liaisons who served as intermediaries between frontline reporters, their sources, and their audiences. And together, their prevailing perceptions reshaped ideas about presidential power and political reality moving forward. So that's one main argument. The second, though most presidential aspirants in the 1976 election cycle accepted the primary role in new politics, that images did not simply communicate messages to the masses, that instead images spoke power, transforming political reality. Carter and his advisors most adeptly exploited new kingmakers under the reform system of showbiz politics. So they embraced wonderkind political consultants, chic celebrities, and horse race obsessed frontline reporters who amplified the anti-establishment outsider salient personal campaign in the mass media. A third argument that you'll gain insight to in this book. In an era marked by crises of confidence in the executive branch and the Fourth Estate, the relatively unknown Southern governor rose to power by evoking a Nixon-inspired antithesis of Kennedy's winning brand. This was a personal uncelebrity campaign that capitalized on sincere messages of moral reform and authentic images of a triumphant underdog. These were resonant appeals for Americans who increasingly distrusted the political establishment's slick, Madison Avenue-inspired campaigns masking corrupt presidential actors. The next main argument. Though Carter's consultants effectively tapped into the pulse of the American public through tools of new politics, their personal campaign failed to resonate with a vital audience, the bicentennial campaign's principal power brokers, the pseudo-celebrity frontline news pack. Collectively annoyed with Nixon-inspired media management techniques and influenced by the trend to privilege investigative journalism, these frontline reporters relentlessly deconstructed political imagecraft probed by the candidate's character and offered a cultural shorthand to convey their critique. The adverse image of an enigmatic, opportunistic politician, which was symptomatic of the changing nature of liberalism and attempts by the Democratic Party's rising star to develop a winning brand. Another argument. Despite increasing scrutiny from frontline reporters and opposition from party regulars, the front-running dark horse endured to become the semi-consensual nominee and the underdog victor by negotiating adverse images and attacking the establishment. This is a tactic that our current president incorporated in his 2016 campaign, I might add, and will happily take questions on at the end. And subsequently, Carter established new rules of primary politics. Amid slick, populist-inspired campaigns and unrelenting coverage of the presidential horse race, many eligible voters, cynical of American politics and the news media, dropped out of the revolutionary electoral process, and malaise ensued while media critics, inspired by misplaced nostalgia, lamented a decline of a golden age of issues-based campaign coverage that informed enlightened voters who freely engaged in the democratic process, a moment that never existed. The final argument. Through an ingenious grassroots media campaign, Carter and his advisors staged the peanut farmers' miraculous rise. But amid an emerging adversarial climate fueled by establishment opponents and elite reporters practicing a penetrating mode of journalistic deconstruction, they failed to translate their permanent campaign into a successful ruling mandate in the White House. Nevertheless, amid the rise of identity politics and the fragmentation of mass media, Carter's political heirs learned important lessons from his failures in media relations and redesigned the media presidency for savvy political actors. This book considers the construction, negotiation, and consumption of Time's Miracle Man, a political outsider who rose to the presidency in a transformational moment in American politics and journalism. Along the way, the narrative privileges certain individuals, media, and moments, while others remain more obscured. The choice of a cultural historian who intends to avoid the cartographer's folly. In the final analysis, though many cultural observers dismissed Carter's campaign and presidency as the final chapter of Watergate, this book reveals that his miraculous rise in the bicentennial campaign signaled a new chapter in American politics and journalism, a seminal transition prompted by a seismic rupture that still reverberates today. Now, if you would like, I think I may have just enough time to share with you from the epilogue, which provides insight into how this book is still relevant to today's existing circumstances. So, epilogue. From lust in my heart to grab 'em by the pussy. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful women. Reality television star Donald Trump confessed to Access Hollywood personality Billy Bush as he fumbled for a Tic Tac on a tour bus on the studio lot nearby the Days of Our Lives soap opera set in 2005. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything. Access Hollywood's live microphone caught private admissions of two public figures, but the tape remained buried in the NBC Universal archives until an anonymous source shared the tip with Washington Post campaign reporter David Fahrenthold in October 2006. The veteran political journalist didn't hesitate. He recognized he was in a race with NBC News to break the biggest story of the 2016 presidential campaign. Allegations of Trump's sexual misconduct caused unrivaled shockwaves on the trail. In the immediate hours following the breaking campaign controversy, frontline reporters and partisan pundits interpreted what the October surprise meant for the Republican nominee's chances on Election Day. This is the end, they said, echoing in unison the sentiment one GOP source confided to MSNBC campaign correspondent Katie Turner. But members of the political establishment and media elite were mistaken. News scandals did not signal the end of Trump's anti-establishment campaign. Instead, they portended the demise of establishment opponent Hillary Clinton and the commencement of the Trump administration. 40 years after the miraculous rise of a peanut farmer from Plains, cultural observers of the 2016 election cycle witnessed a resurgence of presidential dark horses, such as Republicans Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina, and Donald Trump, and Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders, who railed against the establishment from an overcrowded field and exploited favorable tendencies in the news media to gain free advertising and national exposure during the invisible primaries. Carter introduced the nation to the marathon campaign, and by the 2016 race, contenders toiled for grassroots appeal, fundraising dollars, political endorsements, and national media attention more than a year prior to the first caucus or primary. With the rules established in the mid-70s now ingrained as the common sense logic of presidential politics, candidates sought pure gold that accompanied free media exposure and recognized that wins in early contests served as psychological springboards to their party's nomination in a landscape biased toward the news media's presidential horse race. Much as they had 40 years prior, elite reporters predicted that eventual nominees would arise from the Washington establishment. But one anti-establishment candidate, practicing a long-perfected brand of hyper-real showbiz politics, thrived in a contentious primary season battle, surviving media scrutiny and party resistance by attacking the establishment. Amid a divisive, hyper-partisan cultural climate, provoked by lingering crises of confidence and legitimacy in American presidential politics and news media, Trump rose to power by harnessing the well-tested tools of reform showbiz politics and the medium of the moment to go public with his authentic, in air quotes, anti-establishment image. Trump's persona as the blue-collar billionaire and his politics of rage, his fear-mongering populist and authoritarian strongman messages delivered in his campaign autobiographies, his reality television show, his tweets, his political rallies, and his Facebook ads resonated with his base of mostly white male, rural, and working-class voters who felt left behind by the American establishment. During the invisible primaries, despite lagging endorsements, campaign funding, and poll numbers, Trump and his advisors recognized that audiences fragmented by the advent of cable and online news increasingly consumed partisan tirades and sensational scandals in ideological echo chambers. And they harnessed grassroots social media to gain vast amounts of free news coverage by exploiting profit-driven news values with a novel campaign fueled by drama-filled conflict and bizarre controversies surrounding Trump's politics of rage. Like his victorious predecessors, Trump harnessed a grassroots media campaign and news coverage biased toward the presidential horse race to win key early contests, and then capitalized on the momentum to generate a psychological advantage and a bandwagon effect that could withstand establishment resistance and media scrutiny and carry him to the party's nomination. Sorry about that. And much as they had 40 years prior, the establishment news media became a dependable, if unwitting, ally in the rise of a political outsider. Legacy reporters resented claims that they contributed to Trump's rise and invested in their decades-old mission of vetting presidential character. They recommitted themselves to scrutinizing deviant messages from the controversial presumptive Republican nominee. But Trump survived additional scrutiny and campaign controversies during his late primary and general election campaign by attacking his adversaries, establishment politicians, and the liberal media. With the mistrust in establishment news media at an all-time high, especially among conservatives, he not only survived, but thrived in spite of, or even because of, controversies, such as the pussy thing. As Rolling Stone Trail reporter Matt Taibbi wrote referencing Cruz's seminal work in the campaign canon, Trump ran against the bus and it worked. We not only couldn't draw blood against Trump, we actually helped him every time we tried and failed to knock him out. Elite reporters from legacy media outlets still committed to detached analysis responded with what media historian David Mindich referred to as a Murrow moment of slanted righteous indignation. But with each editorial rebuke of his latest controversy, Trump further denounced his two prevailing establishment enemies, the Clintons and the biased news media. And his conservative alt-right followers, who long distrusted the liberal establishment media, coalesced behind the candidate, who was ultimately more of a product of a polarized political environment and an increasingly hard-edged media climate than a producer of it. Trump ultimately benefited from the shifting terrain in the hybrid media campaign. Despite any disaffection toward establishment news media, Carter and his successors were expected to cull rapport with elite reporters, key architects of presidential images. And this in mind, they begrudgingly offered reporters on the bus human interest crumbs, only cautiously critiquing campaign journalism with acknowledged risks to their political fortunes. But Trump defied this common sense political logic and ran against the bus. Trump and his advisors understood that during their lifetimes, political reporters had lost credibility with many Americans by publicly injecting themselves into the system as political actors. And they circumvented any remaining authority by establishment reporters to vet political actors through calculated attacks on social media. Trump's sudden and probable rise signaled for some cultural observers an unexpected an unexpected world too, but an unexpected end of the world of U.S. politics as we know it. A disruption of the matrix that used to tie politics, media, technology, and the citizenry in fairly predictable ways. But as most incisive analyses of the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign suggested, Trump's campaign bore the indelible imprint of crises of confidence and legitimacy in showbiz politics and adversarial journalism rooted in the last half-century. And his administration's Reagan-inspired shock and awe media barrage masked a moment of disjunction in presidential politics not encouraged since the Carter administration. Not encountered, not encouraged, sorry. Amid this milieu, historian and media critic Eric Alterman recently warned that we have moved closer to the world that distinguished 20th century commentator Walter Lippmann foretold in his seminal Liberty and the News. Men who have lost their grip upon relevant facts of their environment are the inevitable victims of agitation and propaganda. The quack, the charlatan, the jingo can flourish only where the audience is deprived of independent access to information. And though it remains to be seen whether long-formed ruptures in American politics and culture can be bridged, we should recognize that without the restoration of historical thinking, we are prone to be complicit victims in the rise of an authoritarian regime. However, in times that try our souls, we might find solace in the faith of ABC News chief Watergate correspondent Sam Donaldson, in the resolve of the American people. Sometimes I look into the future and say, how is the system going to survive? Donaldson admitted. And then I have to believe it will, because I think that Winston Churchill was right when he said, Americans will always do the right thing after they have tried everything else. Thank you for listening closely over the past 20 or so minutes. Now I invite questions from you all as we begin the question and answer session. Okay, so I see the first question here. James asks, what was the most surprising aspect of the media coverage of Carter's campaign that you uncovered in your research? It's a good question. Surprising aspect of the media coverage. Let's see. Well, in advance of the research that I engaged in, I knew that reporters had really began to hone in on Carter's faith, starting in March of '76, and that was after a campaign event in North Carolina. His sister, the evangelist Ruth Stapleton, had catalyzed her network of evangelists within the state, and it became a campaign issue for those frontline reporters. So even though they were well aware of Carter's commitment to his faith, they really focused on it as a news peg once it kind of entered the campaign narrative. And then they really engaged in, as a pack, in the sensationalizing of his faith as a campaign issue that ultimately led in the summer of 76, George Will, the conservative Whig syndicated columnist, to question Carter's faith and to note that the American people had potentially a problem with it, not because it wasn't just a symbol to Carter, because it was a part of his daily life, and for the idea of willy-nilly decision-making that might stem from it. Other things that surprised me in terms of the coverage, Carter as an enigmatic politician. Now, Carter did engage in kind of rhetorically facile positioning on issues, such as abortion and amnesty. But if you look, a lot of reporters said he doesn't have issue stances, and in fact, he actually had pretty well-articulated issue stances on issues from A to Z. That his issue staff, being led by Stuart Eisenstadt, had carefully constructed with his guidance. So that continued to be a theme. One that Carter critiqued in his Playboy interview in the summer of 76. So that was his way of attacking the elite establishment news media. He has this great quote about how the news media only wants to cover something if it's a 15-second gaffe. They don't want to cover my position on the issues. But ironically, they covered what he said about lust in my heart instead of that comment. So I think that answers that question. Thank you, James. Okay. So, and here's one from Bill Hunsiger. Emphasizing that they had a campaign of outsiders, one of Carter's advisors said that if Zbigniew Brzezinski, becomes national security advisor, this would have been for nothing. Do you get into how they reconcile their contradictions? Just sort the book, so I haven't read it. Congrats, it looks good. Yeah, so it does, to a degree, it does get into the reconciliation of contradictions within the campaign. It probably engages more in that alongside race and gender as opposed to foreign relations. Let's see, other questions. So Neil asked, do you believe Carter's campaign strategies would be as effective in today's hyperpartisan political landscape? Yes, I do. I think that they still, that Carter provided the blueprint that's still being followed today in many respects, particularly that strategy that he started engaging in during the invisible primaries when no one was really covering him. He said, essentially the establishment news media isn't covering me because I'm an anti-establishment politician, a Washington outsider. And so he was engaged in that critique very early on. And as I said in the epilogue, that's something that Trump certainly engaged in. He also engaged in the strategy of going public, and particularly going local. So in establishing that grassroots campaign, and what I ultimately call a grassroots media campaign. So gaining local media attention for his innovative grassroots work. And that's certainly still well established and well utilized today. Another thing, Neil, I could answer this question all day. Another thing that he engaged in that was novel in its time and that's still in use today is inviting celebrities to not only to endorse him, but to engage in celebrity benefit concerts on his behalf. That was definitely a part of his strategy in '76. So all of those funds were matched by the national government. Moreover, it was a way of catalyzing his volunteer base. So essentially attracting the youth vote and inspiring them to get involved in politics. People are saying I'm doing well. That's very nice. So I know you interviewed President Carter. What was it like to meet President Carter in person? That's a good question. So I grew up as a child very much around my great-grandmother and all of her friends. And so I'll admit, like, I was nervous to interview President Carter, but then there was something comforting about the fact that he's an older gentleman. And so when I walked into his office, his back was turned to me, and like there immediately was something comforting to me about kind of being in the presence of this man. Then he turned, and he has the same piercing blue eyes that both his staff and journalists talked about on the campaign trail. And I think he probably saw the look of like kind of being at ease and then nervousness immediately like in my eyes, because one of his first very, very kind gestures was to tell me to have a seat and to go on to tell me that he had read my first book and that he had enjoyed it very much. So LSU Press, when you re-release the first book in paperback, please put that promotional blurb on the back. Okay, next question. What did Carter say about the role of the press in political campaigns? Not only did I look at, thank you for that question, Elizabeth. Not only did I look at what Carter said about the role of the press in political campaigns, but I also looked at what the press was saying about the role of the press in political campaigns. And so I'll give you some insight into both. So first of all, Carter, he was still very, very, I would even go as far as to say bitter about press coverage of his campaign and his presidency. Particularly what he was bitter about was something that his press secretary, Jody Powell, had warned him might make him bitter at some point. And that he had warned him in a memo, a handwritten memo. And basically that was about anti-Southern bias in the news media. So Carter ran on kind of the coolness of the New South, right? So redneck chic. And as much as he was trying to harness that, his advisors were warning him that there was still kind of an anti-Southern sentiment around the country. And basically you could see the manifestation of regional bias in political coverage, and particularly where I saw it a great deal in my own analysis is around the summer convention, the Democratic National Convention in July, which was in New York. And they really emphasized Carter as an outsider, Carter as like country boy goes to the city, emphasized kind of his Southern drawl, and really kind of continued to engage in I think some regional bias in reporting around what they call the period in Plains, which was a strategic interlude in his campaign. They had gained so much from the kind of picturesque scene in Plains that they went back there that summer in hopes of kind of benefiting from the imagecraft of that scene, of that town. And ultimately they encountered a deep probing, some of which was very fair, but some of it which had an element of regional bias in it. Carter, for his part, was still very, very upset about an editorial cartoon in the Washington Star that had accompanied his inauguration. It had an outhouse on the White House lawn, and it had his mom with a hayseed coming out of her mouth. But then I think I'm imagining the second question that I just put here, but I'm going to answer this part too, Elizabeth, because what did the press have to say about the role of the press in political campaigns? And the reason I want to engage with this is because David Broder wrote a really important piece and engaged in an important interview in the summer of '76 around the campaign reporting, in which he critiqued the horse race mode as a sensationalized mode, and in which he critiqued objectivity for objectivity's sake. Within that quote, he goes on to say that objectivity demands that you give something equal weight that is otherwise absurd. And I think that both of those critiques are particularly salient still today. I think that our news media still engages in really sensationalized coverage of scandals on the campaign trail, and biases there's a bias towards the news value of drama on the campaign trail, which what we saw in 2016 was that Trump was effectively able to harness that bias. So, moreover, I think that his comments, Broder's comments on objectivity were right on the money. We know that objectivity privileges the official source, I'll continue with more questions. My audience is very nice. Lots of congratulations. I appreciate that. Okay, so 2 more questions here. What is a key lesson or 2 that Biden can learn from Carter to help him win this fall against Trump? Well, what are you, on Biden's campaign staff or something? Are you trying to get free advice? Just teasing. So I think that Biden has already learned a great deal. Of course, he was a political actor in that moment. So I think that, and also is a poli-sci major and a history major. So I think that he has a great appreciation for context. And one of the things that I know that he is engaging in right now is a pretty in-depth vetting process of his vice presidential running mate. And that's actually something that Carter's campaign established in '76 as a strategy to avoid another Agnew and Eagleton debacle, as it was put in the coverage of the day. And so, what I would encourage Biden to do is to listen to the voice of the people in that process. Well, I have a piece coming out in the Washington Post about that in a week or so I won't say more. You'll have to read the piece, Will. Sorry. What other things can Biden learn? There's more. He can learn more from Carter. So Carter had one of the most elaborate transition teams and processes, and Biden is certainly working on that as well. His transition process started in May of '76 when he was just the semi-consensual nominee. Basically, what ultimately happened with Carter that I think Biden can learn from is the press caught wind of some internal strife between the transition team and the campaign staff. And ultimately, that became a big news peg and took attention away from the work of the transition team. Ultimately, much of that transition work went unheeded. And the press ultimately came away and I don't mean to talk about the press as a monolithic entity. I will say that I do think that there is a consensus brand of journalism that reporters engage in. One that certainly Tim Cruz discusses in his work, Boys on the Bus. But so sorry for that aside, but that's important as I go forward because collectively what was being amplified was that the White House was in disarray. And that's before Carter ever entered the White House. So that was the consensus kind of reportorial interpretation of Carter's transition team. And so I think that it's really important for Biden's campaign staff, if they're engaging in transition work, to certainly, if there is any kind of internal strive, not to make that visible, but also to be very clear about where they are in the process and to really project an image of being organized and well structured, because I guess it's really important to recognize that those early images that appear in the news media, that they take on a life of their own in ways. That certainly was the case with Carter in his own image. Okay, so now I've got a question from Diane Bragg. Considering George Will's comments about Carter's faith having an influence on decisions, what do you think has resulted in the current evangelical Christian vote that seems to expect governance will be driven by religion? Did Will misread concern about faith and governance? First, I'll offer a little bit of context. So Carter was able to capture some of the evangelical vote. He was certainly approaching his faith from the perspective of liberal Christianity. And of course, this was at a time when we see the emergence, the coalescing of the religious right. And so it was really disheartening, I know, for Carter to have his quote to Playboy about lust in my heart, which was his explanation of a passage in Matthew that basically says, if we've ever looked upon another woman, we've committed lust, we've committed adultery. So that was him explaining kind of his basic understanding of a biblical passage that is in alignment with, supposedly, what Christian folk believe, but it was completely sensationalized in the news media. And then among the emerging coalescing religious right, there was a lot of critique of Carter for giving the interview to Playboy, and also for using what they call crude, earthy language, salty language to describe sexual intercourse. So he said shack up. Let me look again at the question. What do you think has resulted in the current evangelical Christian vote that seems to expect governance will be driven by religion? I mean, certainly after the coalescing of the religious right, the religious right threw all their weight behind Reagan, and he certainly attempted to harness their support. But then when in office, he kind of ignored them largely. And I think that, Diane, I don't know. But it's really frustrating to me as someone who comes from a faith-based background. Certainly in the 90s, I had members of my own family who said if I was a Democrat, I could not be a Christian, that I could not be saved. So I don't know. And also what another frustrating element is how, if evangelical Christians were so disenchanted with comments of Carter about lust in my heart. Their acceptance of the hate and the acts that Trump has engaged in, I don't know how that aligns with their faith, honestly. I really don't. So I think that they probably need to engage in a deeper reading of their Bible and some deep self-reflection, because, yeah. All right, so other questions. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I think I saw one more from Elizabeth. Let's see. In your analysis of Carter's campaign style and the discourse in the press, did you get the sense that there was widespread cynicism in the candidacy? Yeah. No, that's a great question. So, Elizabeth, to answer your question, back as early as February of 76, there was already, so now this is a moment in which individual voters are supposed to have more agency within the system, and already you saw voter apathy. It's a story that some reporters did focus on, but certainly didn't give it as much attention as it merited. And then certainly by election day, a point that I note in the conclusion, a lot, and even by the convention, a lot of voters had dropped out, like just were completely disengaged from their civic duty, from civic engagement. That said, many did tune in on election night to see who was going to win, but they were more interested in like the kind of horse race narrative than political engagement. And I think that is largely because of the tone on the campaign trail that was established by both the political actors and the journalists, and certainly the tone in the general election. That general election campaign got really negative in tone, between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Now today, by today's standards, we would say that like was mild, but at the time it was perceived as kind of extremely negative in tone, and a lot of people checked out from that. What else can I ask of you? Or not ask of you. I can't really ask anything of you. I can ask you to buy the book. Buy the book, send it to my house, I'll sign it, send it back, free of charge, except for the buying of the book. Any final questions? Okay. Well, I think we're kind of going to wrap up here. Maybe as kind of a final act, I will share, what should I share? Just share maybe my thanks and gratitude for your taking an hour out of your day to listen to something that I worked on for a decade. I really, really appreciate that, and I appreciate you all. And I would encourage you all to become politically active if you're not, and to get out and vote, because that action affects real, meaningful change. All right. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, and I'll see you later. Hopefully in person.